The world number one was supposed to own Toronto. The spotlight was built for her. The biggest court was hers. The cameras were waiting for her, and the tournament had every reason to believe the story would revolve around her. But then Eala arrived, and within days, something happened that nobody in Toronto could have planned. The crowd didn't simply cheer for Eala. The crowd reorganized the tournament around her. That is the part of this story that matters, because this was not just another young player getting popular. This was a 21-year-old Filipina walking into one of the biggest tournaments on the Dota calendar and creating a demand so intense that organizers had to rethink where she would even play. And the first warning sign came before she hit a single ball in Toronto. Tickets, they disappeared. Fast, Eala's opening session reportedly sold thousands of tickets in roughly half an hour. Fans who had expected to watch her in a smaller setting suddenly found themselves fighting for seats. The message was immediate. People were not buying tickets just to watch tennis. They were buying tickets to watch Alex Eala. And that distinction is enormous, because Toronto is not a small tournament. This is a WTA 1000 event filled with Grand Slam champions, top 10 stars, former world number ones, and players who have spent years building international fan base. Yet Eala's arrival created something different. She brought a fan base that was emotional, organized, and hungry to see one of their own on one of the biggest stages in the sport. And then came the decision that changed everything. The tournament had originally placed Eala on a much smaller court. That made sense on paper. She was still outside the top 10. She was not the tournament's number one seed. And normally, the biggest court belongs to the biggest names. But the numbers forced the organizers to reconsider. The smaller venue simply could not accommodate the demand. So Eala was moved to center court, the same kind of stage normally reserved for the tournament's biggest attractions. Think about that for a moment. A player who had only recently announced herself to the wider tennis world was suddenly being placed on the biggest stage because thousands of people wanted to see her. That is not normal. And it becomes even more interesting when you look at what happened next. Because once Eala stepped onto that court, the numbers became noise. The atmosphere became the story. Against Alicia Parks, the crowd was so involved that the chair umpire repeatedly had to ask spectators to settle down. Cheers came at unexpected moments. The energy rose between points. And every time Eala produced another big shot, the stadium responded. Now, there is an important distinction here. Not every crowd reaction was perfect. Some moments crossed the line between passionate support and poor tennis etiquette. But remove that debate for a second. Look at the bigger picture. The stadium was reacting to Eala, not because she was the highest ranked player on the court, not because she had the biggest URSM, but because the audience had emotionally connected with her. And that is something rankings cannot manufacture. Here is where this story gets even bigger. Just days earlier, Eala had achieved something historic in Washington. She had become the first Filipino woman to win a WTA singles title. That victory was already enormous, but the timing could not have been better. She did not arrive in Toronto as an unknown prospect searching for attention. She arrived carrying a trophy. She arrived with momentum. She arrived with an entire country watching. And she arrived with something every tournament wants, but very few players can create. A reason for casual fans to care. That is why the ticket situation matters so much. Because tennis tournaments can promote ranking, they can promote rivalries, they can promote star power, but they cannot simply order a crowd to become emotionally invested. That has to happen organically. And Eala's supporters had already made their choice. They wanted to be there. They wanted to see her. They wanted to experience the moment. And Toronto noticed. The tournament itself began acknowledging the phenomenon. That is when this stopped being just a fan story and started becoming a business story. Because when organizers change court assignments based on demand, they are making a commercial decision. They are following the audience. And the audience was following Alex Eala. But there was still one question hanging over the entire situation. What would happen when the hype met pressure? Because selling thousands of tickets is one thing. Playing in front of thousands of people who expect you to win is something completely different. And against Parks, Eala found out exactly how heavy that expectation could become. She came out flying. The first set was almost perfect. Eala controlled the rallies, moved Parks around the court, and looked completely comfortable under the brightest light. She took the opening set 6-1. The crowd was roaring. The momentum looked unstoppable. Then everything changed. Parks found her serve. The free points started coming. The rallies became shorter, and suddenly, the player who had looked completely in control was being forced to solve a completely different problem. The second set slipped away, 6-4. Now the stadium had gone from celebration to tension. And this is where you learn something about a player, not when everything is going perfect, but when the momentum disappears. Eala had already felt the crowd behind her. Now, she had to feel the pressure of that same crowd. Thousands of people expected the story to continue. Thousands of people expected another win, and Eala had to find the answer herself. This was the real test. Not the ticket, not the headlines, not the fan chants, the third set. Because if Eala could survive this moment, the Toronto story would become much bigger than a popular player getting a big crowd. It would become proof that she could carry expectations with her. And that is exactly what happened. Eala settled down. She stopped chasing the moment. She returned to her patterns. She made Parks work. And slowly, the control returned. The third set belonged to Eala. 6-2. Comeback completed. The crowd exploded. But perhaps the most revealing part came afterward. Eala did not act like someone who believed she had conquered Toronto. She did not talk about being the center of attention. She did not make the story about herself. Instead, she focused on gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had shown up. Gratitude for the support. And gratitude for the opportunity. That reaction tells you something important about Alex Eala, because beneath all the noise surrounding her, there is still a young player trying to understand just how quickly her world has changed. A few months ago, she was fighting for recognition. Now, entire sections of a WTA 1000 tournament are being reshaped because people want to watch her. And Toronto may have just given the tennis world its clearest warning yet. Alex Eala is no longer simply participating in the conversation. She is becoming the conversation. But there is another name waiting further down the road, a name that changes the entire equation. Aryna Sabalenka, world number 1, Grand Slam champion, one of the most recognizable stars in women's tennis. And if Eala keeps advancing, the question becomes impossible to avoid. Who owns the biggest stage when these two finally meet? Because Toronto has already shown us something. Eala can bring the crowd. She can survive the pressure. She can turn a smaller court into a major event. Now comes the harder part. Can she do the same thing against the biggest name in the draw? And that is where this story gets dangerous. Because if Toronto was the warning, what happens when Alex Eala takes that same momentum into Cincinnati and then into New York? If Toronto proved that Alex Eala can command a stadium, New York could reveal whether she can command the biggest moment of her career. Because the story is no longer simply about crowd. It is about expectation. And that changes everything. A player can surprise people once. She can have one incredible tournament. She can defeat a higher-ranked opponent and create headlines. But when the same thing keeps happening, the conversation changes. Suddenly, people stop asking, how far can Eala go? They start asking, who can actually stop her? That is the shift happening around Alex Eala right now. And Toronto may have accelerated it. She arrived in Canada carrying the biggest title of her young career. She had already proven that her Washington breakthrough was not a fluke. Then, she walked into Toronto and immediately generated a level of demand that forced the tournament to adjust. The court changed. The crowd followed. The pressure increased. And when the match itself became difficult, she found a way through. That last part may be the most important, because popularity gets you attention. Winning under pressure keeps it. And Eala is beginning to understand both sides of that equation. Look at what happened against Park. The opening set created the perfect script. Eala dominated. The crowd was behind her. Everything seemed to be moving in one direction. Then, Parks fought back. The second set disappeared. Suddenly, Eala was no longer playing the match everyone expected. She was playing against momentum, against nerves, against the weight of thousands of people waiting for the next big moment. And she answered. That is the kind of experience that changes a young player's career. Because the next time she walks onto a packed stadium court, she will know something she did not know before. She knows what that pressure feels like, and she knows she can survive it. That matters when the next opponent could be someone like Aryna Sabalenka, because Sabalenka represents almost everything Eala has not yet had to face on this scale. Power, experience, Grand Slam pressure. and the expectation that comes with being ranked number 1 in the world. Sabalenka does not walk onto a major court hoping people notice her. People already notice. She enters expecting to win. That is the difference. But Eala has something equally valuable. She has momentum, and momentum can be extremely dangerous in tennis, especially when a player begins to believe that no stage is too big. Toronto was supposed to be another stop on Eala's schedule. Instead, it became a statement. The fans came, the tournament reacted, and Eala delivered. Now imagine that same player walking into Cincinnati. Then imagine her arriving at the US Open. Different city, different atmosphere, much bigger pressure. But the same question follows her. Can Alexandra keep making the impossible look normal? Because the expectations are already changing. A few months ago, beating an elite opponent would have been treated as a shocking upset. Now, another big win creates a different reaction. People expect the next one. That is how a prospect becomes a contender. And that is how a player becomes commercially powerful. The tennis world has spent years searching for stars who can pull new audiences toward the women's game. Eala's appeal is particularly interesting because it reaches far beyond traditional tennis circles. She represents the Philippines on a global stage. For Filipino fans, this is not simply another player. This is someone carrying a national identity into arenas where the Philippine flag is suddenly impossible to miss. And that creates something rankings cannot measure: belonging. A Filipino fan watching Eala in Toronto is not just watching a tennis match. They are watching someone from their community compete against the biggest names in the sport. That emotional connection is powerful, and it explains why the crowd can become so intense. But here is the part that could make the next few weeks even more fascinating. The bigger Eala becomes, the harder every opponent will fight to stop her. There will be no more surprise factor, no more easy introduction. Opponents will study her. They will prepare for her movement. They will attack her weakness. They will try to turn her patience against her. And the pressure will no longer come only from the opponent. It will come from everyone expecting another breakthrough. That is the next level. The first breakthrough is about proving you belong. The second is about proving you can stay there. And Eala is entering that second phase. Toronto gave us another clue. When the match became uncomfortable, she did not panic. She adjusted. That may become one of the defining characteristics of her career. Not overwhelming everyone with raw power, not winning every match in straight sets, but finding solution, changing rhythm, making opponents play one more ball, and refusing to disappear when momentum turns against her. That style becomes especially dangerous over a long tournament, because eventually someone is going to have a bad day against her. A top player will miss, a favorite will lose concentration, a heavy hitter will struggle with timing, and Eala will still be there, waiting, grinding, returning, believing. That is how deep tournament runs happen. Not because everything goes perfect, but because the player survives the moments when it doesn't. And now we come back to Sabalenka. The world number 1 is still the world number 1. Nothing about Eala's popularity changes that. Nothing about a packed stadium changes the rankings. But tennis is not played on paper. It is played point by point. And that is where Eala has already shown that she can make elite opponents uncomfortable. So when these two eventually share the same court, the storyline will be much bigger than a ranking battle. It will be power against patience, experience against momentum, the established superstar against the rapidly rising challenger, and perhaps most importantly, the player who already owns the ranking against the player who is beginning to own the room. That is why the next few tournaments matter. Cincinnati is not just another event. It is the next test. Can Eala walk into another city and create the same energy? Can she handle the attention after Toronto? Can she keep winning once opponents begin treating her like a genuine threat? And then comes New York, the US Open, the biggest stage of them all. If Eala reaches that quarterfinal collision with Sabalenka, the question will no longer be whether she belongs. That question will already be answered. The question will be whether she can take the next step. Can she beat the world number 1? Can she turn all this momentum into another historic victory? Can she walk into Sabalenka's section of the draw and make the entire tournament revolve around her? Because that is the trajectory we are watching. Toronto started with tickets, then came the bigger court, then came the crowd, then came the comeback, and now comes the expectation. That is how a phenomenon is born. Not in one match, not in one headline, but through a series of moments that become impossible to ignore. ignore. Ella has already given tennis several of them. Washington gave her the trophy. Toronto gave her the crowd. Cincinnati could give her another test. And New York could give her the stage she has been building toward. So now I want to hear from you. If Ella meets Aryna Sabalenka at the US Open, who wins? Do not give me a safe answer. Give me your prediction. Straight sets, 3 sets, an upset nobody sees coming? Put your score in the comments. Because if Toronto has taught us anything, it is this. Never assume Eala is walking into someone else's moment. Sometimes she walks in and makes it hers. The world has started paying attention. Now the question is how far this can go. And if Eala keeps winning, the next stadium may not be asking who she is. They may already know. Eala. Remember the name.